What's going on, guys, and welcome back to WrestleRant. I'm Graham Giason Matthews. This is another Dark Side of the Ring review, Season 6, Episode 10, the Season 6 finale, Becoming Muhammad Hassan. They saved one of the best episodes for last. Honestly, the last 2 weeks were my probably favorite, and I don't like using the word favorite because a lot of these episodes and subjects have to deal with pretty heavy and sensitive subjects and topics and whatnot. But I was looking forward to this one, especially because it was a lot different than all the other stuff they've covered on the season so far, and really just the show in general. It didn't have to do with death, at least in terms of who they were focusing on. Didn't deal with alcohol abuse or drugs. There was a little bit of depression there towards the end, which you would expect given the circumstance of what happened. But beyond that, I thought this was a pretty lighthearted episode. You really won't learn a whole lot you didn't already know, considering this only happened 20 years ago, and Muhammad Hassan was a pretty, not notable name for it, but for anyone that kind of came up during that period of watching WWE. I started watching WWE soon after this in 2008, so this completely missed me. But having seen Hassan in like the WWE SVR game, specifically SVR 06, he wasn't in SVR 07, he was gone from the company by that point. He was long gone. Is someone who had, played as him in those games and was familiar with the whole gimmick and the incident and the controversy that was going on back in 2005 in WWE. I was very interested to see this episode and hearing his perspective too. He's done other interviews talking about it. I haven't really checked those out, but he was out of the public light in the whole wrestling world thing for so long that hearing him come back in and talk about the whole controversy from his perspective with a clear head and now having gone on to, spoiler alert, achieve great success outside of wrestling, it was very fascinating to me. So a lot of people may say, oh, they should have ended the season with the Daphne episode. And that did have a happy ending in terms of them talking about the legacy she left behind and, how great she was and how fondly she's remembered by her peers and fans and whatnot. And that was a very good episode. But it was also very fucking depressing because it just happened literally 3-4 years ago. This happened 20 years ago and didn't have, thankfully, a similar fate. This was a lot of a different outcome, which was nice. But that was a great episode, and this was great for different reasons. So if you like these Dark Side of the Ring reviews, like I said, this is the Season 6 finale. But we have reviewed and watched every episode of the show here on the channel, and I've broken them all down. So go back and check them out in the description box down below, a whole playlist devoted to my Dark Side of the Ring reviews here on the WrestleRant channel. Be sure to like the video if you enjoy the review that we're about to get into. So let's get into it. They open up the episode talking about that in the absence of The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin and stars of that caliber, WWE in the early 2000s was struggling to create new stars. So they look to OVW. They show shots of Batista. They show shots of John Cena. They show shots of Brock Lesnar. All of these guys went on to become multi-time world champions and some of the biggest stars WWE's ever seen. Muhammad Hassan also came through OVW. Now, not a part of the '02 class, but he was there soon after. And I don't know how long he was there for, but before this happened. But his name was Mark Magnum, I believe, at the time, which is a pretty fucking cool name, to be honest with you. If they had just stuck with what he was doing as Mark Magnum or whatever his ring name was at that point, I am very curious to see how far he would have actually gone. But he had a great look. He was only 24 years old, he said at the time. Probably younger when he was in OVW. He was 24 on the main roster, they said, which is wild. I thought he was older than that. But, between the look and he had decent in-ring skills, he wasn't like a great in-ring technician by any means, but he had potential. Very curious to see how far he would have gone. But it wasn't long after he arrived, apparently, that they wanted to give him an Arabian gimmick. They wanted to make him Arab. And he was just an Italian guy from Syracuse. And they talk about later on, or he does anyway, how his family actually did deal with prejudice earlier in his life, coming to America from Italy and all this other sort of stuff. So I thought that was interesting. But it's not the same thing as having an Arabian gimmick when you're not Arab. It's just a totally different thing. So he talked about how his family was trepidatious. He was trepidatious. It was a very weird thing to agree to, but it was his job, and that's what they wanted. So Marc Copani is his real name, I believe is how you pronounce it. He actually mentions he was in school, probably college, maybe Syracuse, but, Cornette said he came from Syracuse. I don't know if he grew up there. I know he grew up in New York, but I don't know if he went to Syracuse University. Regardless, he was actually in college at the time when 9/11 happened, and he remembers watching SmackDown, that SmackDown live taping they did 2 days later. He remembers watching that live and being inspired by it. And then to think that, they would use 9/11. He would literally say that in promos on the show. Like they showed it here in this episode that he would say, since 9/11, since 9/11, since 9/11. Like to think that they would later then use the same incident that he was inspired by as part of his gimmick years later, and not in a good way, is kind of mind-blowing. But he got paired with Sean Daivari, who was also around at that point. And by the way, just thinking off the top of my head here, obviously he's not interviewed for the episode because he's in WWE now as an agent. They talk about that. But like, if the whole edict was get rid of Muhammad Hassan, which is what it came to at the end of his run, which we'll get into, why didn't they do the same thing with Arya Daivari? Not Arya Daivari, I'm sorry, Sean Daivari. Arya Daivari is actually his brother. He's in AEW now. That I get the Daivaris mixed up sometimes in terms of the names. But Sean Daivari, because he was just Daivari in WWE for a long time. How did they not boot him from television? Was that ever explained? Not on this episode, it wasn't. But I've always wondered, like, if they were so hell-bent on getting Hassan off the show. I mean, I'm glad it didn't happen to Daivari because he wasn't around for that much longer. I mean, he was around for probably a year. He managed the Great Khali for a little bit. And then they gave him Rajang Singh, I believe, instead, the Great Khali that was his new manager after Daivari. So Daivari wasn't around for much longer, but he was on TV. He went from SmackDown to the ECW roster to the Raw roster. He was around for a little bit. And they did not give him that same treatment, which is good because they should not have given Hassan that treatment. But it's not like Daivari was out there doing the same gimmick that he was doing with Hassan, obviously. But it is interesting that they couldn't find another role for Hassan, but they could for Daivari. I mean, again, he wasn't doing the same gimmick, but it would have been interesting to see, I don't know, that explained as to why that was okay. Because he was a big part of the act. I mean, he was a fucking martyr during one of the angles they shot on SmackDown during the whole London bombing thing. Daivari was very much involved in that storyline. But anyway, moving on here. They tried out the new characters in OVW, and it wasn't really until they filmed the vignettes talking about, honestly, they're kind of positive vignettes. I mean, he was talking about it from a heel perspective, but he mentions how that was when the characters really started to take shape. And in these vignettes, he's talking about being like an Arab American, which obviously in real life he's not. But he mentions how people kind of look at him with like disgust in the wake of 9/11, and he's not, he's trying to go against the stereotypes. Yet they slotted him as a heel. It just didn't make any sense. It would have been a lot easier for them to just embrace the stereotypes, which they ended up doing anyway. And I'm not saying they should have, but like they embraced the stereotypes with other people years and decades earlier. So I guess it wasn't racist or whatever to have done that. It wasn't racist for them to go the route that they did, to say, oh yeah, we're against the stereotypes, but still position him as a heel, which was encouraging these stupid-ass fans to then boo people like Hassan himself, people with his skin color and stuff like that. It's basically implying that he is the bad guy because of what he represents, which is kind of very fucked up. I don't know, just the psychology there was wild. And he even mentioned he was supposed to be an American of Arab descent. But I guess soon after his debut, like he made a flight joke, and he knew at that point, like, this shit is going to be crazy. Like, if they're allowed to get away with that, like, imagine what more could come from this character, and did come from the character. So he officially debuted on Raw in December of 2004, interrupting Mick Foley, a pretty prominent way to make your debut. And right from the get-go, he was cemented as anti-American. And like I mentioned, he talked about how his family actually previously experienced prejudice. And they also talk about the previous attempts by WWE to do similar storylines, with Sergeant Slaughter being an Iraqi sympathizer back in 1991 for his WrestleMania match with Hulk Hogan. Yeah, that failed. And they took a different approach to this, but it still sucked, and it failed all the same. Like, just stop. Like, Vince loved his foreign heels. They were still doing this shit up until a few years ago with people like Rusev and Jinder and stuff like that. And honestly, if they could get away with, quote unquote, what they were getting away with early on of the Hassan character in 0405, for a fact Vince would have been doing that in the mid-2010s. You think he learned his lesson to think, oh yeah, no, they just stopped doing it because they got caught. The sponsors were going to pull out. That was what happened. If the sponsors didn't have an issue with it, they would have kept doing it. And they would have done it with other people down the road as well. But he talked about how Hassan did, how he had to be out of character, out of the ring at all times. And he would face prejudice in airports in real life, like he would be wearing, a hijab or whatever, like he would be wearing like this Arabian garb and whatnot. And he would be judged by, like, there would be a woman walking with her daughter and she would kind of like walk away from him. This was in the wake of 9/11, and that fell on those people to think like, oh yeah, if you're of that skin color, you're bad. Like, I mean, obviously, that's terrible too. But and he saw that stuff firsthand, so he could sympathize with people that were actually dealing with that. And he wasn't even of actual Arabian descent. That's the craziest part. Like, people would think legitimately that he was. And the people that knew that he wasn't were upset because it was offensive to them, which it was, and totally understandable. So anyway, he actually tells this story about how Kurt Angle approached him for saying, oh yeah, he's using your camel clutch, which was Hassan's finisher. I think Angle was just trying to pull a rib on him. And he was trying to make him, go talk to Eddie about doing the camel clutch. You don't want other people doing your finisher, especially when they're just kicking out or it doesn't look, it's just a regular move. So for whatever reason, Hassan believed that and actually did talk to Eddie, who then told Hassan, yeah, it was actually my grandfather's move. He actually made up the move. So I've been doing it a lot longer than you have. And he was cool about it, but Hassan was so embarrassed. Word got out to the rest of the roster. He had so much heat about it. Eddie actually forgave him, which was interesting. He did mention that. And then Eddie passed away later that year in real life. They talk about the segment he did with Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania, obviously the Real American, just the segment that made sense. Never a match, but he did get to do, work a segment with Hogan at Mania, which was pretty surreal. And then they fast forward to when he got drafted to SmackDown in the summer of 2005, and he started getting assisted on TV by men with ski masks. They started helping him. Extremely racist shit. Very problematic. And he actually expressed his concern with doing the storyline and portraying the character. And Stephanie McMahon, who was in charge of creative at that point, said, we got it taken care of. There's nothing to worry about. Basically, just shut up and do your job. And even Snitsky, who was interviewed for this episode and was around at that point, along with Chris Masters, who's also interviewed, they talk about how no one really turned down storylines, but Hassan did, because he was like, okay, this is not going well. I'm very uncomfortable. And they basically told him to just deal with it. And he even said here he was very vocal about the direction of the character and where it was headed, and he just wasn't a fan. And Cornette even outright says WWE was planning to put one of the two top titles on him. And then they kind of specify after that where they said where the angle with The Undertaker, of all people, the fucking Undertaker who he was feuding with, was supposed to lead to a number one contenders match at the Great American Bash. And then he would beat Taker there. And then he would beat Batista at SummerSlam for the World Heavyweight Championship. That was what I always heard. And it honestly makes sense when they also make the point that SummerSlam was in Washington, D.C. Now, that's Batista's hometown, but it's also like, capital of the country. Like, that would be a perfect place in their minds to do an angle like that where Hassan, the first world champion in WWE of Arab descent, wins the world championship. That would be nuts. So that was the plan. They actually confirmed that here. We'll never know without hearing it from Vince, who will never talk about it, obviously. He doesn't talk at all these days. But, I just thought that was interesting and worth pointing out, although a lot of people already knew that. So earlier in the day of a SmackDown that made air on July 7th in 2005, actual bombings happened in London. And they continued to air the show as was, with an angle they filmed with Hassan choking out Taker, kind of like mimicking a beheading. Like, they showed that he would do this in matches with like Shawn Michaels. And there was actual beheadings going. I mean, even now that happens. And it was going on back then. And it was a very touchy subject. He knew he probably shouldn't be doing it, but it's not like he did it out of instinct. Like, they told him to do it. And they did basically a beheading angle of The Undertaker on SmackDown. He would choke out Taker, and it was supposed to like be this whole beheading thing. This was after a match that Taker had with Daivari, where Daivari was basically like the sacrificial lamb. It was some fucking weird-ass shit. And SmackDown aired as is. They did not change the segment. And Daivari was carried out as a martyr, they talked about. And it made big headlines. They actually show articles that were written about the angle and how distasteful it was and how controversial it was. I don't know, the newspaper, maybe New York Times or something. But they show the editor picture for whoever wrote it. It was actually Alex Marvez of AEW. Easy for me to say. The go-to interviewer in AEW. Not go-to. He's, that's Renee Paquette. But, he's been in AEW since day one. So I saw his picture. I saw the name. I'm like, oh, fuck, that's Alex Marvez. I know he used to write about wrestling and do stuff like that. But to see his name here as part of this storyline, I thought was interesting. But anyway, so the angle made headlines. They actually interviewed a writer here that was working in WWE at the time. They interviewed him for this episode. And he spoke up about how we should not be doing this. We are going in the wrong direction. This is a bad idea. And then he was subsequently stripped of his duties. just for saying how wrong it was to be doing the angle, which he was right, obviously. But instead, you get punished for speaking out and speaking your mind, and that's exactly what happened. WWE inevitably felt the pressure from the sponsors. And Hassan asked John Laurinaitis, who was in charge of, talent relations and stuff like that at the time, or maybe he was still Jim Ross, but either way, he was a pretty high official up in the company. He said, what's going to come of this? I have to put an offer on a house soon. Like, what should I do? Laurinaitis, the only thing he told him, Hassan said, was, don't buy that house. And he knew then he was fucked and that he was on his way out. He wasn't allowed to be on TV anymore, but he could make an appearance on the pay-per-view to pay off the angle and get beat by Taker, killed off by Taker. He was basically in storyline murdered. That was how they wrote off Muhammad Hassan on WWE television. He said, because the pay-per-view took place in New York, he drove home from Buffalo to his home that night and never went back. He was never on the road again. Like, they knew on that night he was done. I got to go back and look it up, but, did they put out a statement saying he was released, or did they just, quietly let him go? And it wasn't as if, we'll see your contract run out, we'll put you on this show, or we'll repackage you. They didn't even attempt to do that. They just fucking fired the guy. It was insane. That would never happen today. Hopefully they wouldn't do an angle that distasteful today, but if they did, would they really let go of the guy and then not see any repercussions? Like the TV networks do. It wasn't that guy's fault. And he mentioned how, no one thought it would be believable for him to be brought back as anything else in WWE or elsewhere, which is why he wasn't brought into Ring of Honor or TNA. No one wanted to hire him. And it wasn't anything he did wrong. It was just insane behavior. So he talked about how he was heartbroken by what happened. He got basically let go of his job for doing his job so well. Like, how insane is that? And he talked about how he didn't have any direction for a few years, and he felt wrestling turned on him. He became depressed. He wondered, he woke up in his bed one day, he was running low on money and all this other sort of stuff, and he wondered how many days he had wasted, and if anyone would give a shit at all if he just never woke up. Like, he was tired or whatever, and was like, what if I just didn't wake up? What if I just, I don't know, what difference do I really make at this point? It was pretty dark shit that he talked about here, just in terms of being depressed and whatnot. And that was kind of his turning point. He talked about how he went back to college after that. He worked nights at UPS. He got his master's degree. He became a principal after that, which I thought he was still doing, but now he's actually a director of human resources in a small city school district, which is awesome. They talk about Daivari briefly, saying that he became an agent for WWE after that. He was actually just RKO'd by Randy Orton at Backlash, if you caught that. And he mentions how he speaks to Daivari all the time, which is cool. Cornette feels like, and obviously not to make light of what happened, but it worked out for the better. He probably is making more money, has a much better life, kids, stuff like that, I believe. Doing what he's doing now than he would have in WWE. Like I said, if they didn't make him, even with the racist character, but even without the racist character, how far would he have actually have gone? He could have been there for a couple years and done well for himself, but would he have fizzled out like a Luther Reigns, like people like that Vince kind of gave up on pretty quickly? We don't know. Could he have been brought back as an agent? We don't know. We have no idea. He's never been brought back by WWE. They really should make good of the guy. Triple H knows. He was around at that point. He probably doesn't give a fuck. But they should make it up to the guy because he did nothing wrong. They fired him for legit no reason. But he does mention he would do it all over again. So I thought that was a really cool ending. I thought it was a really cool episode. Again, you really don't learn a whole lot more than you probably already knew about Muhammad Hassan, the life of Marc Copani. But I really thought this was, I don't know, I've always been fascinated by the whole Muhammad Hassan ordeal. I hope they do more episodes like this. They don't always result in death or alcohol abuse or their, life's in the shitter or they're doing drugs and all this other sort of stuff. They've been blacklisted. He was blacklisted 20 years ago from wrestling, but he's since turned his life around and it's kind of a success story now, which is cool. But I'm glad they did this episode. It was probably a weird one to read on paper for some people, like, oh, what's so dark about that? Which is true. Like, what is really all that dark about Muhammad Hassan? But, the ending there kind of got dark where he talked about contemplating suicide. That was kind of crazy. And I just overall enjoyed the episode. I thought it was a really interesting watch. And I thought it was a great way to close out the season, honestly. This and the Daphne episode back-to-back were a very strong way to close out a very good 6th season of Dark Side of the Ring. So, as far as future topics, I honestly have no idea. We were just batting around the idea on WrestleRant Radio the other day, and some people brought up a few different people. Scott Hall, I've seen batted around. I think they did an episode on him, or they scrapped it last minute. Not sure what's going on there. But him, Perry Saturn, I've seen people talk about. That one would make a lot of sense. Sabu, probably a little early. I'm not even really sure what that would be about anyway. They just did an episode on his uncle, so Probably not. A lot of different episodes that could be done. But maybe it's just something as simple as this, where like WWE, I mean, it's not dark. Again, you can't really get into a habit of doing stuff like this all the time. But the occasional episode on a thing like this where WWE fucked up on the booking of certain talents and it really affected their life. I mean, that did happen in other episodes, but in this episode, it was strictly a booking thing and not like anything he did. So, very interesting episode. Give it 2 thumbs up. Overall, enjoyed season 6 of Dark Side of the Ring. Let me know who else you want to see on the show going forward as far as topics you want to see them discuss. And be sure to check out all my other Dark Side of the Ring reviews down below in the description box. Whole playlist devoted to every Dark Side of the Ring review I've ever done for every episode, dating back to season 1, 5-6 years ago. So check that out when you get a chance. Also, consider signing up for becoming a WrestleRant All Access Pass member. $5 a month to get you a lot of great perks. More information on that down below. And just be sure to like this video, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel. All the support is amazingly appreciated. Thank you guys for sticking with me and checking out all my Dark Side of the Ring reviews, especially for the first time over video. Previously, they were only ever audio. Now they're video going forward, which is very cool. But again, guys, thank you so much for the support. I appreciate it. We'll be back hopefully with season 7 at some point. Until then, have a great one. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.